For years, he wore the badge, thinking it made him untouchable. But today, in just 3 minutes, everything he thought he knew about power would come crashing down. When Officer Daniels laughed in his face, mocking his ID, no one expected what happened next. And by the time the dust settled, he was the one in handcuffs. Stay till the end to see how the tables turned. If you stand against abuse of power, like, comment, and share. The street was quiet, bathed in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. Marcus Reynolds had just left a late meeting and was on his way home, his mind preoccupied with the presentation he had to give in the morning. He wasn't speeding, he wasn't swerving, he wasn't doing anything wrong. Yet, the second the red and blue lights flashed behind him, his stomach tightened. With a sigh, he pulled over, gripping the steering wheel as he glanced in the rearview mirror. A police cruiser rolled to a stop behind him, its headlights glaring like interrogation lamps. A tall, burly officer stepped out, adjusting his belt. Officer Daniels. His uniform was crisp, his badge gleaming under the streetlights. But what stood out the most was the smirk on his face, the kind that said he had already decided how this was going to play out. Marcus took a slow breath, keeping his hands visible on the wheel. He had been in situations like this before. He knew the rules. Daniels sauntered up to the driver's side window, tapping on it with deliberate slowness. Marcus rolled it down, keeping his expression neutral. "Evening, officer," Marcus said, his voice calm. Daniels tilted his head. "Evening," he echoed, his tone dripping with something just beneath the surface, mockery maybe. "License and registration." Marcus nodded, reaching for his wallet with slow, deliberate movements. He had learned a long time ago that any sudden motion could be misinterpreted. He handed the officer his ID first. Daniels took it, but instead of examining it, he glanced at Marcus, then let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," he scoffed, shaking his head as he flipped the ID between his fingers like a playing card. "You expect me to believe this is real?" Marcus frowned. "Excuse me?" Daniels grinned, waving the ID in front of him. "Come on, a guy like you? This can't be yours." Marcus felt his patience thinning. "That ID is real. My name is Marcus Reynolds. I live 2 blocks from here." Daniels ignored him, still chuckling. "Man, you must have thought I was born yesterday." He glanced at the ID again, then let out another laugh. "Says here you're a federal officer." His laughter grew louder. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't react. He just stared. Daniels leaned against the car. "Let me guess, you printed this out at some copy shop? Stole it from someone?" He looked back at his cruiser. "Maybe I should call this in. See what the boys downtown think." Marcus exhaled through his nose, his heartbeat steady. "Go ahead," he said. "Call it in." Daniel's smirk flickered just for a second. Then Marcus saw it, a twitch in his hand. The officer was reaching for his taser. The game was changing. And in exactly 3 minutes, Officer Daniels would realize he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Marcus watched as Daniels' fingers hovered over his taser, his smirk twisting into something uglier. "You seem awfully calm for someone about to be in a world of trouble," Daniels sneered, taking a step closer. "Let me guess. You think that badge you printed out is going to save you?" Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. Daniels let out a fake sigh and shook his head. "Man, I see this all the time. Guys like you thinking you can play pretend." He held up the ID, waving it mockingly before stuffing it in his pocket. "I'll be keeping this. You won't need it where you're going." Marcus clenched his jaw, but he refused to break his calm. He had dealt with men like Daniels before, men who mistook the uniform for power, mistook the badge for permission. Daniels took another step forward, his shadow stretching across the car. Then, in one quick motion, he unlatched his taser. Marcus saw the shift in his stance, the way his muscles tensed. Daniels wanted him to react, wanted an excuse. "You know," Daniels continued, his voice lower now, almost casual, "I've had a long shift. I don't really feel like doing all the paperwork. So, here's what we're gonna do. You step out of the car, nice and easy, hands where I can see 'em, and maybe, just maybe, you won't end up face first on the pavement tonight." A threat, not even a subtle one. Marcus inhaled slowly, keeping his hands firmly on the wheel. "I'd reconsider that if I were you," he said quietly. Daniels snorted. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Marcus finally turned his head, locking eyes with him. "Because in about 2 minutes," Marcus said, his voice calm, "you're going to regret every decision you've made tonight." For the first time, Daniels hesitated. Marcus didn't blink, didn't flinch. He could feel the shift in the air. Daniels didn't know why, but something about Marcus's tone, the absolute certainty in it, unnerved him. But the officer shook it off, tightening his grip on the taser. "Yeah? And what exactly do you think is going to happen?" A sharp crackle suddenly echoed through the air. Daniels stiffened. His hand froze over his taser. The sound wasn't coming from Marcus. It was coming from the radio clipped to Daniels' shoulder. "Unit 12, a voice came through. "Do not detain the suspect. Repeat, do not detain. Stand down immediately." Daniels' face paled. Marcus just sat there, unmoving. "Unit 12, the radio repeated. You are to step away from the vehicle. The individual in question is a verified federal agent. Failure to comply will result in immediate disciplinary action." Daniels' lips parted slightly, his breath hitching. "What?" Marcus exhaled, finally leaning back in his seat. The game was over. And Officer Daniels had just realized he wasn't the one in control anymore. Daniels's grip on his taser tightened as his mind scrambled to process what had just happened. His radio was still crackling, but he wasn't hearing anything anymore. The blood was pounding too loudly in his ears. Slowly, Marcus turned his head back toward him. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Daniels feel like the ground beneath him was crumbling. "I'd suggest you step back," Marcus said, his voice eerily calm. Daniels blinked, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. He had spent his entire career bullying people, flexing his authority, treating his badge like a weapon. And now, that power was slipping through his fingers. "Unit 12, acknowledge." The radio voice was sharper now. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Daniel's mouth moved, but he couldn't seem to form a response. How? How was this happening? Marcus sighed, almost as if he were disappointed. "See, this is the problem with guys like you," he said. "You think power comes from a uniform. You think it gives you the right to do whatever you want, to whoever you want." Daniel's face twitched. "Shut up," he snapped, but his voice wasn't as steady as before. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Or what?" Daniels flinched. He barely even realized he had done it, but he knew Marcus had noticed. The radio crackled again. "Unit 12, final warning. Stand down immediately." Daniels exhaled sharply, clenching his jaw. Slowly, he pulled his hand away from the taser, his fingers stiff. Marcus nodded. "Smart choice." Daniels took a step back, his mind racing. This wasn't possible. There was no way this guy, this nobody, had connections powerful enough to override his authority. Then, headlights washed over them. Daniels turned sharply, his breath catching as two black SUVs rolled up to the curb, their tinted windows giving nothing away. The doors swung open in perfect synchronization, and out stepped 3 men in dark suits. No uniforms, no badges, just power. Daniels took another shaky step back, suddenly feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. Marcus exhaled and finally opened his car door. He didn't rush, didn't hesitate. He simply stepped out, dusted off his jacket, and nodded toward the men. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes, gave him a curt nod. Then he turned his attention to Daniels. Officer Daniels. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge of authority beneath it. Daniels' mouth was dry. "Yeah?" The man pulled out a folder. Thick, heavy, official. Daniels' stomach dropped. "You're coming with us." Marcus didn't say a word. He simply watched as Daniels' face lost all color. For years, the officer had laughed in the faces of the people he pulled over, mocked them, threatened them. And now, no one was laughing. Daniels took another step back, but the man in the suit didn't move. He just stared at him, his presence alone, suffocating the air. "This is a mistake," Daniels blurted out, shaking his head. You can't just—" Marcus let out a quiet chuckle. "Can't just what?" Daniels snapped his gaze back to him, his frustration boiling over. "I didn't do anything wrong." Marcus finally turned fully toward him, standing tall, steady, unmoved. "You stopped me for no reason," Marcus said. "You laughed at my credentials. You reached for your taser on an innocent man because you assumed you could." His voice was calm, controlled, dangerous. "And now that you're the one under the spotlight, suddenly it's a mistake." Daniels clenched his fists, his breath coming quicker. "I was just doing my job." Marcus's expression didn't change. "No, you were abusing it." The man in the suit stepped forward now, slowly flipping open the folder in his hands. His voice was just as unreadable. "Officer Daniels, you are under federal investigation for multiple civil rights violations, falsified reports, and excessive force complaints, most of which have been buried until today." Daniels' face twisted. That's a lie. Who the hell do you think you are?" Marcus didn't answer. He didn't have to. Instead, the suited man held up a document. "This is an official order placing you on immediate suspension, pending a full investigation. Effective now." Daniels's chest heaved. He looked between Marcus, the men in suits, then back at his own patrol car like it was some kind of lifeline. "No," he muttered. "No, this is wrong. This isn't how it works. You can't just—" Another voice cut through the night. "Actually, we can." Daniels turned sharply, and his stomach dropped. A second patrol car had just pulled up. But this one? It wasn't one of his boys. It was internal affairs. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable. Daniels stumbled back, his face paling. "Wait." One of them, Sergeant Miller, shook his head. "It's over, Daniels." Marcus watched as the officer who once stood so tall, so confident, suddenly looked small. For years, Daniels had walked these streets like he owned them, abused his badge, threatened people, mocked them, and now he was the one getting placed under investigation. Daniels turned to Marcus one last time, his face full of disbelief. "You set me up," he whispered. Marcus gave him a small smile. "No, Daniels, you set yourself up." The suited man nodded toward the IA officers. "Take his badge." Daniels' hands trembled as he reached up, unpinning his badge from his chest. It felt heavier than it ever had before. With shaking fingers, he placed it in Miller's open palm. And just like that, he wasn't a cop anymore. Daniels stood frozen, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps as Miller closed his fingers around the badge. The metal gleamed under the streetlights, a symbol of power that no longer belonged to him. "You can't do this," Daniels muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But even he didn't believe it anymore. Miller sighed. "Daniels, I suggest you stop talking before you make this worse for yourself." Daniels' eyes darted around, searching for some kind of escape. But there was none. His entire life, his career, his authority, had unraveled in less than 3 minutes. Marcus took a slow step forward, stopping just close enough for Daniels to hear him clearly. "You thought the badge made you invincible," Marcus said, his voice quiet but sharp, "that you could do whatever you wanted, hurt whoever you wanted, that no one would ever stop you." He tilted his head slightly. "How does it feel to be wrong?" Daniel's hands curled into fists, his jaw locking. But there was no fight left in him, not anymore. The suited agent stepped in again, flipping another page in his folder. "You'll be escorted to the station for questioning. If I were you, I'd start thinking about how much you want to cooperate." Daniels glared at him, his pride still clinging to whatever scraps of power he thought he had left. "And if I don't?" The agent gave him a knowing look. "Then I hope you enjoy your last few weeks of freedom." Daniels' stomach twisted. Miller gestured toward the second patrol car. "Let's go." The reality of the moment finally crashed over Daniels. His face twisted, his lips parting as if to argue, but there was nothing left to say. Slowly, he turned around, placing his hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists was deafening. Marcus watched as the officer who had once threatened him with a taser, laughed at his ID, and dismissed him as nothing, was now the one being led away. Daniels kept his head down as they placed him into the back of the IA patrol car. No smirk, no arrogance, no power, just silence. Marcus exhaled and rolled his shoulders back. It was over. Or at least, it was over for Daniels. Marcus turned, nodding toward the suited man. "Appreciate your timing." The agent smirked slightly. "You gave us exactly what we needed, and for the record, he's not the only one we're looking into." Marcus raised a brow but didn't push. There would be more officers like Daniels, but tonight, at least one of them had finally answered for what he'd done. As the IA car pulled away, disappearing into the night, Marcus slipped his ID from his pocket. The same ID that Daniels had laughed at. He turned it over in his fingers, then tucked it away. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. And this was just the beginning. Marcus stood by his car, watching as the patrol car carrying Daniels disappeared down the road. The night felt different now, lighter, freer. For years, people like Daniels had abused their power, wearing their badge like armor, believing they were untouchable. But tonight, that illusion had been shattered. A deep voice pulled Marcus from his thoughts. "You good?" He turned to see Agent Collins, the man who had led the takedown. His stance was relaxed, but there was something sharp in his eyes, the look of a man who had seen too many cases like this. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." Collins smirked slightly. "Thinking about how close that was?" Marcus chuckled. Thinking about how many more there are." Collins's expression sobered. "Daniels isn't the first, and he won't be the last. But what you did tonight, that's going to send a message." Marcus exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "Let's hope they get it." Collins watched him for a moment before slipping a small card from his pocket. He handed it over. "Keep in touch. We could use guys like you." Marcus looked down at the card, running his thumb over the embossed letters. It wasn't just any contact, it was direct access to a federal anti-corruption task force. He let out a breath, nodding as he tucked it away. "Appreciate it." Collins gave him a knowing look. Something tells me we'll be seeing each other again." With that, the agent turned, heading back toward his SUV. The rest of his team followed, their presence fading as quickly as they had arrived. Now, it was just Marcus and the empty street. He glanced down at his ID, the same one Daniels had mocked, the same one he had refused to believe was real. A badge didn't make someone good. A title didn't make someone right. It was what they did with it that mattered. Slipping it back into his wallet, Marcus exhaled and opened his car door. He had a long night ahead of him. Because this wasn't just about Daniels. This was about every name on that list, the names that still needed to answer for what they had done. Marcus pulled onto the road, headlights cutting through the darkness. And as he disappeared into the city, one thing was clear. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. If you stand against abuse of power, don't just watch. Make your voice heard, like comment and share.